Hello everyone, and welcome to the Game Engine programming series where we write a game engine from scratch. In the last video, we started working on creating the user interface for the geometry component. We finished the part that displays a geometry asset that has a single LOD with one submesh. We'll start today's video by adding the UI elements for assets with multiple LODs and submeshes. We add a tab control that has a tab item for each LOD, and each tab displays the list of submeshes. The tab header simply displays the LOD index. We can use the alternation count for this purpose. Of course, we don't show this tab control if there is only one LOD with one submesh. In that case, we use a style trigger to collapse the tab control. We'll also hide the tab header when the geometry asset has a single LOD with multiple submeshes. This is done by changing the item container style, which in this case is a tab item style. Finally, we define what the headers of tab items should look like. As I mentioned, they'll just display the LOD indices. Now we are going to define data templates for each LOD. This is how an LOD is going to be shown in each tab content. When we have multiple LODs, we'll show each LOD's name and threshold. Then we'll display information about each submesh in a stack panel using an items control. Therefore, we have to define a data template for a submesh. It's a border with a background that changes color when the mouse is over the border. Within this border, we show the name of the submesh, and again we use the alternation count to enumerate the list of submeshes. We don't show this information if there is only one submesh. The submesh icon is displayed in a border's background. We don't use the border's content to set an image because it doesn't clip the image with the rounded corners. Instead, we create a visual brush from the image. Next to the icon, we'll display the mesh information such as vertex count and index count. And finally, we add the expander that will contain the material input controls. When running the editor, we'll get a few binding errors caused by the tab control's default style. It's looking for a tap strip placement property, which can't be found right away. We are going to fix that in a minute, but let's see if everything's still working. After saving the project, we can inspect the content of the project file, and here we see the information about the geometry component and the applied materials. As we saw in the last video, we have an issue here that's caused by a texture asset not being unloaded at shutdown. I'm not going to spend time fixing it right now, but I'll fix it in the next episode. Okay, next we want to add drag and drop support to the content browser. For this, I wanted to have the same behavior as in Windows File Explorer, where you can select one or more items and either drag them or change the selection by clicking on them. The default behavior of the list view items that are used in our content browser, however, is different, causing the selection to change before we start dragging. We can modify this behavior by subclassing from list view and list view item. By the way, this is adapted from an answer on Stack Overflow that you can find with this link. So normally we would lose the previous selection when we click on an item, because then that item would become selected. Obviously, this would interfere with drag operations. In order to keep the selection, to see if the user will drag items or just wants to make a new selection, we postpone handling of the mouse left button down event if the item is already selected and it wasn't a double click event. Otherwise, the event is handled as before. When the user releases the left mouse button and the selection was deferred, then we handle the click event here. Otherwise, the regular button up event is handled. Defer selection field is set to false again using a finally block to make sure that it's set to false no matter what happened during the button down event handling. And it's also set to false when the mouse is moved away from the item. And then in our list view subclass, we tell it that it should use the new list view item. All we have to do now is replace the list view and list view item in the content browser with this one. We do need to add and use the namespace where we put the list view X class. We also have to do this where we define the style for the list view. And again, I managed to make it look more complicated than it actually is. Now, when we open the project in the editor, it's trying to load applied materials and it checks if they have a valid GUID. However, I forgot to add a data member attribute to the GUID property in the asset base class, and therefore the GUIDs are not saved, which causes this assertion to fail. Again, this will be fixed in the next episode. Here we can see that we can still select the items as before. Now we can go ahead and add drag and drop to the content browser. While I'm here, I'm going to do a bit of cleanup in the XAML code. Actually, let's also add nice rounded borders for the icons. As I mentioned before, simply setting the corner radius of the border wouldn't clip the content of the border, even if we set the clip to bounce property to true. One way of doing rounded borders for the content is to clip the image itself using a rectangle geometry as the clipping mask. Unfortunately, we can't bind the rectangle size here to whatever the size of the image is. So we have to add a converter that constructs a rectangle from the image size. Okay, now really let's add the drag and drop functionality. To do this, we add 3 new event handlers to our list view. This is done for the preview mouse left button down, preview mouse left button up, and mouse move events. Using these methods, we determine if the user has started dragging the selected items. Therefore, I added 2 new fields for the click position and a boolean to indicate if the user is currently dragging. In the mouse left button down event handler, we check if the event was originated from within the list view item. If so, we set drag start to true. And it's set to false when the left mouse button is released. If the mouse is moved while the left button is still pressed, we calculate the distance it moved. If it was moved more than 10 pixels in any direction and the start drag is true, then we create an array of file paths from the selection and do the drag and drop operation. At the end, we set drag start to false. Remember that we can also import assets using drag and drop. So we need to disable the drop border that would otherwise appear when we start dragging asset files. Okay, now we can drag items and drop them onto anything that accepts asset files. In case of geometry component view, we have to handle the drop event when we drop something onto the border displaying the asset icon. If the event arcs contain drag and drop data, then we get the first asset that has the mesh type. If there was such an asset, we get its asset info and use its GUID to set the geometry for all selected geometry components. Before doing so, we remember which asset each one of the components was using so that we can undo the change. We do the same after the geometry has been set for all selected components. From this, we can construct and add the undo redo action. Note that setting the geometry is done asynchronously, so the editor's UI doesn't stop while the meshes are being loaded. In reset geometry, which is called when we undo or redo the change of geometry assets, we use the recorded GUIDs to set the geometry for each component. As you can see, this method is not complete, since we also need to reset the materials used by each geometry. We'll come back to this later when we are working on the material handling part of the UI. Let me turn off this assertion for now. I'll put it back when the issue is fixed. So now we can drop a mesh asset onto this border and it will change the geometry. When we select multiple entities that use different mesh assets, we can see this icon telling us exactly that. We can drop an asset onto this and it will replace the old meshes. Again, this can be undone as well. I remember that we didn't check if assets with multiple LODs display correctly here, so let's try that next. Here we have a mesh with 3 LODs and it's shown as intended. However, I think the tap control design is sticking out like a sore thumb, so let's change that. We only need to restyle the tap items that contain the header for each tap. We can copy and paste the original tap item style and modify it to our liking. It's a big one, but don't worry, we'll throw away most of it. We also need to copy over the color definitions. I'll update these first so they match our color theme. I'll also add a couple more brushes for the text color. So this already sets the colors and we are basically done. But I'd like to add a thin blue border on top of the selected tap. We can add it in the template definition of the tap item. Now, the original tap item style has triggers that will change the orientation of the tap item depending on tap strip placement. This could be used to display the taps on the left, right, top or bottom side of the tap control. Remember that this property gave us the binding errors earlier, so I'm going to remove this altogether and only use the case when the tap items are placed at the top. If we ever need other orientations, we can define additional styles and switch between them using style triggers. So I'll get rid of all of this and define a few that we actually need. And it turns out that we only need 3. 1 for mouse over, and 2 more for the cases when the tap item is disabled and for when it's selected. And here we can see our beautiful tap items. And with that, we have come to the end of this episode of the Game Engine programming series. Hopefully there was something new for you in here that you could use in your own project. Next time we'll go and fix all the issues that we have with uploading and unloading assets and do various improvements to the code we worked on in the last few episodes. Thank you as always for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.